Hello, my name is Thomas Schuttenhelm, and I'm the Artistic Director at Network for New Music. And we're getting ready for some performances coming up in February on Sunday the 26th at Rose Hall at the campus of University of Pennsylvania, and on Monday, February 27th at St. Thomas Church. Today I'm here with Chris Burns, who is going to be one of our featured composers on these concerts. Network has commissioned a new work from Chris, and he's going to tell us about his new work called The Algorithm in just a moment. But before we discuss his specific commissioned new work, I'd like to talk with Chris a little bit about his compositional journey. So Chris, could you tell us a little bit about what got you into composition?
Sure. I was lucky to have access to a bunch of musical experiences as a kid. Piano lessons and then trumpet lessons and playing in school bands and jazz bands and such like. I got very interested in playing rock and roll music as a teenager, and in particular started exploring keyboard synthesizers. And that will lead into some of the interests in technology that came later in my work. And then when I arrived at college, I thought, okay, I'm really excited about music. I want to study further, and realized that composition in particular was the thing that was interesting to me. And so that was the moment where I started learning more about classical music and more seriously about classical music. Eventually followed that up with graduate study at Stanford University. And then have been working in various classical, experimental, avant-garde, whatever the right terms are for what we do now, modes for the last 20 to 25 years.
Right, and that's something I would like to talk with you more about is like what genre do you think that your music fits into? Where is it placed in the sort of aesthetic spectrum?
That's a great question. I think it's easier for me to think in terms of the kinds of musicians that I work with and the sort of modes and approaches than it is to come up with a convenient label. Chamber music is a really appropriate term for a lot of the work that I do. It's mostly written for small groups. Sometimes I am a member of those small groups. I do a lot of improvisatory playing, sometimes in very free and open situations, and sometimes in situations that are more structured and where there is some kind of notion of a score. But that dialogue between musicians and that kind of the idea of the musical conversation is one that I've always found particularly compelling. Sometimes that means it's a string quartet, and sometimes it means it's a group of people with novel electronic instruments.
Yes.
We're kind of expanding the definition of chamber music, but maybe that's the best idea that I can offer.
Is there something about the intimacy with a chamber situation that is conducive for your creative impulses?
Definitely. As a creator, I'm always interested in constraints and limitations. The infinite canvas is not nearly as interesting to me as the very small area in which I might work. And so I don't merely think of chamber music as limiting, because as you say, that intimacy is also really important. And just that sense of conversation and dialogue and work together among equals.
Yes.
And there's also, the social dimension of playing music together, and that word play is very important to me. And the friendships that I form through music making are very important to me. I think that's something we don't talk enough about in music making, but definitely something that leads me to that chamber format, those small groups.
Indeed. And I want to go back to a couple of themes that you introduced, as you mentioned the synthesizer. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about the role of technology in your creative activities.
Sure. It's a huge part of what I do, especially here in 2023, and a big part of the algorithm in particular. I think the first way that I got really excited about technology, I was privileged to be a kid during the kind of initial personal computer revolution, and further privileged to be in a household that could afford a personal computer.
Yes.
And so that Apple II Plus that couldn't really do very much if you didn't start tinkering with it and learning to program was really, really influential on me. So I got very excited about computer programming from a relatively young age. I haven't done a lot of formal study in computer science, a little bit. But that's something that I've always carried with me in a kind of a fascination on the one hand and a tool that was available to me on the other. And then putting that together with the keyboard synthesizers and the idea of using electronics to make sound and being able to work with sounds that weren't so familiar, not only not acoustic, but not heard previously, the potential for kind of new sound and new timbral exploration, all that kind of stuff got really exciting to me. And then that really braided together very tightly when I was studying in graduate school. Stanford University has a very important computer music program, and it was very clear there, okay, here's how you can be using computers to make music, both in familiar and in exotic ways. And so I spent a lot of time doing that. And as a result of that, a lot of the work that I now do is programming. So for instance, in making the algorithm, the score itself is really a computer program which generates scores, and there are infinite permutations which are available from that. And so the work of composing the piece has not been so much making dots on paper as writing code which can generate some dots on paper.
So let's take a look at just one page from the algorithm. So tell us more, Chris. How did you come up with this program? How did you come up with this concept? Take us through that creative process, if you would.
Well, it starts with my work as an improviser. While I lived in the Bay Area, I started hearing more and more improvised music for the first time, and I was familiar with very conventional and mainstream jazz, but didn't know about the kind of wider range of improvisational practices. And the Bay Area was a hub for that in the late 90s and early 2000s, continues to be a fairly important center for it. And so I was making friends in that community. I was hearing more and more of those friends' performances. And I started to think, okay, maybe this is something I want to try and something I want to get involved with. I wasn't a terribly capable performer at the time, but I started thinking, well, what if I built electronic instruments that I could play? Are there ways that I could get at the kind of intellectual and emotional activity of music making without needing the highly refined physical skills that a gifted violinist has, for instance? So electronics became a path into that for me, and I started creating electronic instruments and playing them. And then I also started thinking about, well, what's my personal pedagogy of learning to play these things and learning to play with others? And one of the ways that I got into that was by making pieces which offered some kind of structure, some kind of constraint, some kind of challenge to the improviser, but also offered a lot of freedom, and where one could still be playing in a very heads-up way, in a way that was all about listening to one's colleagues and responding and navigating music together. And yet there was this scored component to it. And that practice proved to be really rich for me, both just in improving as an improviser, but also in terms of stimulating my creativity along a bunch of paths. So the algorithm is now 10 plus years into that process, the latest manifestation of these kind of structured improvisation projects. And when you approached me and suggested that I might do something for Network, this was the idea that came to mind, was, okay, how can I use these computer programming skills that I've been working with to try to create something that does provide these kind of infinite combinations, and where it becomes this kind of puzzle that we as the musicians on stage then try to solve.
Yeah, and I find it really interesting because I see and hear in your music now, you said the word combination, it's sort of unification of all of these themes we've been talking about, the creative impulse, along with technology to aid you, whether that technology be, in a sense, using your programming skill in computers in the same way that one may think of any composer as a programmer. Maybe writing a sonata is programming a sonata. And also this idea of improvisation, especially in the context of a chamber ensemble where you do get that intimacy. But something I see too in your music is, especially because it is so graphically interesting and beautiful to look at, is that you are certainly allowing the musician some freedom, almost empowering them to be part of the creative process with you.
That's right. And the algorithm is a great example of a piece which is truly a collaborative project. Yes, my name goes at the bottom of the score, but it doesn't happen if I'm not working together with other musicians and we're performing it collectively. And I'm depending on their intelligence, their creativity, their musicianship to help bring the piece to life. The score might be a beautiful object to look at, but until it happens on stage and it happens between all the musicians involved, it isn't really music.
Yeah, and you're bringing back that idea of the social element to it, that sort of being there in the moment, in the room, makes it especially meaningful for everyone.
Definitely.
Now, you also have a graphic component to it as well. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
So I started thinking at some point that I was working on these graphics that were present in the score, and I was having a lot of fun with that. It's an interesting challenge for me. I'm not a trained designer or illustrator, and so I'm trying to use the computer as a way to create these graphics and generate stimulating possibilities. And I thought, well, I don't really want to show the audience the score pages. I'm not comfortable as a performer. I didn't want to put the other performers on the spot with, having the audience critiquing, how well are you executing that section on page 3? It's not the right situation.
Well, it doesn't translate quite like that, does it?
Exactly. But I thought, well, maybe I could do something similar. I've worked with digital animation before. And so are the kinds of techniques that I'm using to generate the score applicable to an animated form in some way? And I started playing with that and thinking about it. And the deeper I got into it, the more excited I got about the possibilities. And so here we are now with these accompanying digitally animated visuals that you'll see projected behind the musicians during the piece.
Excellent. And we know that you've been to one rehearsal of which the musicians are preparing for these performances. Tell us a little bit about that experience that you had working recently with those musicians.
Well, it's, again, here we are in that social experience. What a wonderful opportunity to meet Chelsea and Tom and Carlos and the other Tom I knew previously, but the five of us immediately hit it off, and it just became this very positive collective. How can we combine our energies to make this music work? And there are a bunch of very specific challenges that the score gives, and so part of our time was spent encountering those roadblocks and figuring out how to drive around or over them, as the case may be.
And that's the sort of real interpretive component of translating some of those graphics into an acoustic reality, isn't it?
Definitely, yes. So when we reach our next rehearsal, I have a bunch of exercises planned, things that use score pages, but that aren't just playing the piece, as a way to sort of practice navigating some of these challenges and constraints as they come up. But then we'll also just do a lot of playing together. I think I've got 10 different versions of the score to bring to the next rehearsal, so we can count on having as many iterations of the piece as we want, so we can keep challenging ourselves with new and fresh material and really practicing how do we find inspiration in these computer-generated pages to make something special happen in the air acoustically.
And I think that's something extra special that you're bringing to us as well, is sort of challenging the notion that a score is definitive and authoritative. in a performance.
Right.
That yours is not quite that. There's much more of a flexibility there. Could you just explore that with us?
Because it's computer generated, and I've spent a lot of time developing this program and carefully getting it so that all the output works reasonably well, tuning it and tweaking it, we can play from a different score at every performance, and even in every reading and rehearsal, we can have a different score that we use. And so one of the ideas here is to throw up some creative dust in the air in a way that then we as musicians have to respond to, find inspiration with and from, and challenge ourselves to create something new in the heat of the moment. And, of course it's possible to find a perfect configuration of something, insert your favorite piece here, and to always try to replicate that in exactly the same way. But I think with an improviser's mentality, the excitement is how do we make it new each time? And so this is trying to have aspects of compositional structure and compositional signature. There is a sense in which this is a Christopher Burns piece, and you'll be able to identify my very particular aesthetic personality in it, and yet we can make it new each time.
Yeah.
And that's the fun and the joy of it, is finding it in the moment live on stage.
Indeed. I mean, I often, when I'm doing improvisation, sort of when you come across that thing that just feels right, the instinct is to, do that again, right? But that's sort of not being in the moment. That's almost against the spirit of improvisation. So we're always challenging ourselves as players and challenging our audiences to sort of take in the continually new. And that's something that I think Network does particularly well. And we're really, really pleased to have you represented on this concert, in particular this newly commissioned work. So thank you, Christopher, for this insightful conversation on The Algorithm, your newly commissioned piece, which will be featured on the Network for New Music concert on Sunday, February 26th at 3 p.m. in Rose Hall at the University of Pennsylvania, and again on Monday night at 7 p.m. at St. Thomas Church. I hope you all join us, and thanks again, Christopher.
Thank you.